Section 8 of Great Events in the History of North and South America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Events in the History of North and South America by Charles Goodrich. United States, Early Settlements, New England or Northern Settlements, Part 3. A settlement at an early period was made in New Hampshire, but it did not, until some time afterwards, constitute a distinct colony. In the spring of 1623, two members of the Council of Plymouth, Georges and Mason, having obtained a grant of a tract of country, sent over a few persons with the purpose of establishing a colony and fishing at the river Piscataqua. This was the beginning of the town of Portsmouth, but for several years together with the town of Dover, which had a fish house erected about the same time. It was a small and scarcely permanent settlement. In 1629, some of the settlers about the Massachusetts Bay purchased a tract of country of the Indians, with a view to unite with the settlement at Piscataqua. After this purchase, the latter settlement was favored with a small increase, but no other settlements were made all the year 1638, when the towns of Exeter and Hampton commenced. Exeter was settled by people chiefly from Boston, who had been regularly dismissed from their church relations, and were constituted at once into a church into their new locality. Like the settlers of the other New England colonies, those of New Hampshire were desirous of enjoying the ministrations and ordinances of the gospel, and were able to obtain excellent ministers. These several plantations continued for many years to live on good terms with the natives, and were generally well supplied with provisions, in consequence of their advantages for fishery. They constituted distinct civil communities, after the most perfect model of freedom, but were unable to preserve their peculiar organization on account of the intrusion of disaffected individuals from the colonies of Massachusetts and Plymouth, and the constant influx of other emigrants. They were too weak, thus, to stand alone, and, after suitable negotiations on the subject, they came under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts in 1641, on the condition of enjoying equal privileges with the people of that colony, and having a court of justice maintained among themselves. This union continued nearly 40 years, and was followed by the greater increase in security of the colony. The rise of the colony at Rhode Island commenced in the expulsion of Roger Williams from Massachusetts. He was a minister of the gospel at Salem, but holding tenets that were obnoxious to the people there, and being unwilling to renounce them. After friendly remonstrance and dealing, he was ordered to quit the jurisdiction of Massachusetts. He accordingly took his exile thence, and traveling with his few followers, as far as the present town of Rehoboth. He sat down there, but being within the jurisdiction of Plymouth Governor Winslow, out of courtesy to the government of Massachusetts, desired Mr. Williams to leave that place. The latter then, crossing the Pawtucket River, came to the spot which, in acknowledgment of God's merciful providence to him in his distress, he called Providence. He purchased the lands of his plantation of the Indian owners, became the father of the colony, and for a period appeared to have combined in his person the principal powers of government. Times of scarcity occurred in the Providence plantation, as in most of the other colonies in North America, and the followers of Mr. Williams were saved from famine only by the products of their forests and rivers. No personal resentment seems to have arisen between Mr. Williams and Governor Winthrop from the proceedings which led to the founding of the new settlement. All the several colonies remained at peace and cultivated friendship with each other. The religious difficulties in Massachusetts, arising out of the case of the fanatical Mrs. Hutchinson, were the occasion of the origin of the Rhode Island plantation, south of Providence. Several gentlemen differed in principle from the prevailing belief of the churches and chose to leave the colony. Among them were William Coddington, John Clark, and others, who came to Providence in search of a place where they might enjoy their own sentiments unmolested. Through the assistance of Mr. Williams, they purchased a quetneck of the Indian Sakums. The adventurers, 18 in number, incorporated themselves into a body politic and chose Mr. Coddington to be their judge or chief magistrate. The character of the climate and soil soon brought many adventurers to their settlement. The territory was Rhode Island, according to its subsequent name. The two settlements of Mr. Williams and Mr. Coddington being destitute of any charter from the mother country. The former went to England with a view to procure one. He succeeded in the object and returned with the liberal charter of incorporation of Providence and Rhode Island plantations. The district, now state of Maine, though the first permanent settlement commenced in 1630, was for a long time in an unhappy condition from the number and hostility of the Indians within its borders. The early settlers, after the death of their proprietary, Sir Fernando Gorges, formed some kind of voluntary compacts and chose their own rulers, but the difficulties under which they labored induced them in 1650 to unite with the government of Massachusetts and to become an integral part of that colony. Their civil and religious institutions generally resembled those of the other colonies of New England. In the first settlements, churches were early established, which enjoyed the labors of some of the worthiest ministers of their time. A project of great importance was consummated in 1643 in the Union formed by the New England colonists. It had been proposed by the colonies of Connecticut and New Haven as early as 1638, but was not brought to a conclusion until 5 years after. The Confederacy consisted of Massachusetts, New Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven. The plan of it evidently reminds one of the Great Confederacy, afterwards formed between the 13 United States, with similar provisions and principles. It was a powerful means of defense and of the subsequent strength and prosperity of the colonies. It maintained their internal peace, awed the savage tribes, and caused their neighbors, the Dutch and the French in Canada, to respect them. By the Articles of Confederation, they entered into a firm and perpetual league of friendship and amity, for offense and defense, mutual advice and assistance upon all just occasions, both for preserving and propagating the truth and liberties of the gospel, and for their own mutual safety and welfare. Each colony was to continue its separate organization as to courts and laws, but to be considered as one in regard to their public transactions. This union subsisted, with some alterations, more than 40 years, and was dissolved when the charters of all the colonies were rescinded by James II. It was known under the style of the United Colonies of New England. The state of Vermont was not settled until long after the other New England states. It was as late as the year 1724, before any settlement was made in that territory. This was on a spot within the present town of Brattleboro, where, at the same time, during a severe Indian war, the government of Massachusetts had erected a fort. It was then supposed that the settlement was within the limits of that state, but it afterwards appeared not to be the case. Subsequently, it was believed that the territory belonged to New Hampshire. Grants were accordingly made from time to time by the latter colony of tracts within the territory of Vermont. As it was the scene of warfare during the middle of the century, the country became well known to many individuals, and not a few openings were made in the wilderness towards the cessation of hostilities on the northern borders. During the Revolutionary War, the Green Mountain Boys, as they were familiarly called, distinguished themselves by their bravery and rendered important service to the cause. In 1777, the inhabitants constituted themselves an independent state. As Vermont was settled mostly by emigrants from Connecticut, the character of the people was similar to that of the inhabitants of the latter state and of New England in general. They were careful to establish their civil and religious institutions in accordance with those of the sister states, and have been highly distinguished by their stability in the principles and usages of the fathers. The character of the early settlers of New England deserves a distinct notice, beyond that which has incidentally appeared in narrating the history of their achievements. A brief sketch can only be presented, and scarcely commensurate with the importance of the topic, but it is all that the limits of this work will admit. The greatness of the results, though affected extensively by the direct providence of God, manifests the peculiarity of the dispositions and motives of the agents who were concerned in producing them. The planters of New England were men of whom their descendants need not be ashamed. So far as the pride of ancestry may be lawfully indulged, New Englanders of the present race may indulge it to the full, in view of the character and deeds of their forefathers. They were inferior men in no sense of the word, however apt we may be to connect the idea of adventurers with that of a roving, restless, dissipated, loose-living class of men, loving savage nature, or freedom from the restraints of civilized life. They became adventurous, not from love of adventure, but from high and noble impulses, the impulses of religion. To advance that precious interest was indeed their commanding object. This was indicated by their circumstances and manner of life in Holland before they removed thence, and by the desire they felt to leave that country. Could their favorite views in respect to religion have been carried out there, they would probably never have come to this western wilderness. Their declarations and professions, through their leading men, also show that the establishment and enjoyment of a free gospel was their great object. Their laws and institutions, moreover, evince that this was their principal concern, in connection with the diffusion of education and knowledge. These all had reference, more or less directly, to the moral and religious welfare of the community. The cause of God and righteousness was guarded by the wisest and most decided legal provisions. The concurrent declarations of all the early writers among them likewise indicate the spirit and purposes which distinguishes the fathers of New England above, perhaps all other settlers of new countries, in proposing and carrying forward the interests of religion. Indeed, no object but religion and its enjoyment could have borne them through their almost unprecedented trials and privations. To these they voluntarily submitted, on account of their religion. They were not otherwise compelled to leave their native land and the homes of their childhood, the seats of ease and plenty, to hardships of any kind. Many of them had never been exposed before. But the love of God's word and freedom of worship according to the light of their own minds were motives with them sufficient to brave every peril and earthly woe. They were not inferior men in respect to their civil standing in the community. They did not proceed generally from the lower orders of society, the poorer artisans and the laborers. They belonged mostly to the middle and respectable ranks of English society. A few were classed with the higher orders, but not to the same extent as was the fact with the settlers of Virginia, if we may judge from the list of names and titles of several emigrants of the different colonies. In respect to a worldly chivalrous bearing and spirit of adventure, New England and Virginia differed. The latter were eminent in this respect, but never were men more truly brave than the fathers of New England. In moral courage, they were unrivaled. Like other adventurers, they manifested their undaunted spirit in relinquishing their comfortable homes, in braving the dangers of the deep, in encountering the horrors of a wilderness, in incurring the risk of famine and pestilence, and in frequently combating a fierce savage foe. There were as extraordinary traits of martial heroism displayed among the Pilgrims of New England, when called forth for the necessity of circumstances, as can be found in the history of any of the American colonists, though this was not a characteristic in which they gloried. The exploits of Miles Standish of Plymouth and John Mason of Connecticut might be ranked among the most striking exhibitions of courage on record. Of Standish, it is remarked by an old historian that he was allied to the noble house of Standish in Lancashire, and inherited some of the virtues of that honorable family, as well as the name. But the high bearing and courage of the planters was eminently of a moral kind. Unlike their Virginia neighbors, they suffered no misrule in their settlements. If any threatened for a time, they promptly put it down. Their courage was seen in resisting evil among themselves. They feared not to put their laws into execution. They were characterized by a healthful, vigorous public spirit, consenting to sacrifice their own individual interests for the general good. They thus manifested a noble nature, the product of principle, if not of birth. The fathers of New England were not ignorant men, and unversed in the concerns of the world. Their clergymen and leading men in civil life were among the ripe scholars of the age. They had been educated at the English universities, and numbers of them had occupied important stations in church and state, as authors and men of influence in their native land. They could not have sunk their high character by emigration, and though in a wilderness and under the pressure of mighty cares, they could not so advantageously pursue their studies as in the shades of academic retirement. They still did not neglect to add to their intellectual stores. In several instances, they brought large and valuable libraries with them. The writings of Colton, Hooker, Davenport, Winthrop, Bradford, Prince, and others show that they were eminently men of mind and masters of language, that they were well versed in the science and literature which adorned the age, and their universal learning, sanctified by grace, we know, was devoted to the most noble and beneficent purposes. There were among the merchants and men of business who had figured in the world's affairs before they came to these solitudes, men of large experience and cultivated taste, not wanting in any accomplishment deemed essential and refined in honorable society. The mass of the people who came over to this country as its settlers must evidently, from the nature of the case, have been of that thinking, intellectual, practical class, who understood their rights and duties as human beings, as also the principles of government, and could not, therefore, with their good sense and honesty, submit to the exactions and wrongs of tyranny. This, of all others, is the most valuable body of the community. The estimate which the fathers placed upon education is seen in the immediate establishment of literary institutions, both of the higher and lower grades. Scarcely had the venerable men felled the trees of the forest than they erected the common schoolhouse, the academy, and the college. In the midst of their untold personal pressing cares and troubles, they exercised a far-reaching sagacity and benevolent regard towards the common good and towards posterity, in laying broadly the foundations of order, intelligence, and virtue. They conceived the highest idea of the importance of sound education to their rising republic. They wisely judged the solid learning and true religion were the firmest pillars of the Commonwealth and of the Church. Within 10 years from the settlement of Massachusetts, a college with good endowments was founded for the use of the colony. The planters of New England were not poor men, needy adventurers. Had they been such, whence could the funds have been derived that were necessary to sustain the enterprise? It is evident that large sums of money were expended in the transportation of themselves, their cattle, and their effects to this country, and in their various removals when here, as well as in the continued sustentation of their families in times of scarcity and famine. These, we know from their history, were of frequent occurrence. Governor Winthrop, Haynes, Eaton, and Hopkins were men of wealth. So also were Mr. Johnson, Mr. Colton, and Mr. Hooker. The last two, uncommonly rich, were ministers. Mr. Johnson was reputed to be the wealthiest of all the original emigrants. The mass of the early comers must also have possessed no inconsiderable means to enable them to bear the heavy expenses of their voyage and settlement. With such a basis of property, it is not a matter of surprise that, notwithstanding the drain and exhaustion of the first few years, they should have increased greatly in their worldly substance in the end, inasmuch as they settled on a virgin soil, possessed abundance of land, and carried on a lucrative trade in the products of the country. Their habits of sobriety and industry were essentially favorable to their advancement in wealth. The New England planters were not wanting in any moral virtues, piety, wisdom, or magnanimity. There never lived on earth, if we may credit history, a more disinterested, upright, conscientious, prudent, and holy body of men. Their souls were imbued with the loftiest principles of patriotism and piety. They gave undoubted proofs of the possession of the Spirit in their exertions, toils, and sacrifices for the best welfare of their descendants and the cause of Christianity. In their spirituality, prayerfulness, purity, and well-ordered lives, they wished above all things to serve God and to do good, to transmit to posterity a pure church and free form of government. They received the Word of God as their sole guide in religious concerns and moral conduct. They regulated their individual life, their families, their local societies, their churches, and their state by its rules, so far as the latter could be consistently applied. They were sound in the faith, receiving the doctrines of grace as the real system of divine truth, were strict in preserving the order and carrying out the discipline of the churches, and were rigid in the administration of law and justice. Their zeal and liberality in supporting the institutions of the gospel among themselves, and in efforts to Christianize the Indians, were marked traits in their character. They considered it one of the great objects of their mission to this continent to become the means of the salvation of its aboriginal inhabitants, and thus to extend Christ's kingdom in the world. In a most commendable degree, they carried their religion in the various everyday concerns of life, and consulted, especially on every occasion of interest and importance, the particular guidance and blessing of God. Such was the character of New England's fathers. They were not perfect men. They did not claim for themselves the attributes of perfection. Neither can others, their warmest panegyrists, claim it for them with any consistency. They had their errors, the errors of the age. All darkness had not passed away from their understandings, not all obliquity from their hearts. There was an austerity, a preciseness in some points, in an accommodating temper, which perhaps is not well suited to all times of every state of society, but which the natural course of imitation from age to age, there will be apt to be a feeble resemblance of the original, so that where the conduct in the beginning was over strict, in the lapse of years it would be apt to fall quite too far below the true standard of virtue. The founders of a nation, if they fail at all in firmness of temper or rigidness of discipline, will be very apt to bring on the sooner a dissolute state of the body politic. Our fathers on this account were not so much at fault as many suppose. They were fitted by the guidance and grace of God for the times in which they lived, for the work which they were called to perform. If some few spots or shades could have effaced from their characters, they would have been still more fitting instruments of good to the church and to posterity. But as the case is, no other founders of an empire probably ever possessed so large a portion of wisdom and goodness. In respect to charges made against the fathers of New England, pertaining to superstition, enthusiasm, injustice towards the Indians, treatment of supposed witches, bigotry, persecution, and the incorporation of church and state. They were capable of a satisfactory refutation in all the material points, and have often received that refutation. While something, however, is to be laid to human imperfection in their case, yet even in these matters, more is due to the grace of God, which preserved them so comparatively free from evils to which their natural dispositions or their circumstances might be supposed to lead them. It was indeed a new order of things which was introduced by the Pilgrim Fathers in their removal to America. The Mayflower came to these shores freighted with great moral principles, as well as with the precious cargo of godly men and women. Of those principles, some were the following, viz., the right of private judgment in the examination of divine truth is to be held sacred. Conscience, enlightened by the word of God, is sufficient guide as to truth and duty. A majority governs in church and state. Universal education is the basis of free government. The observation of the Sabbath is a moral virtue and essential to the safety of a people. From these principles others have been deduced, or to them others of scarcely less importance have been added in more recent times. End of section 8.